Ha 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 ha. Hello. Hey guys. Now we're continuing in chapter 5, and in my edition of the book, it's page 146. We're going to be talking about a new type of verb today. It's called a stem changing verb or a boot verb. Now, before we get into that though, we need to do a slight review of some concepts that we've learned in weeks past. So what I want you to remember and see if you can recall are the endings for your AR, ER, and IR verbs. And if you look behind me, you'll be able to see that I've written them up for you as a quick review. Can you remember what they are? Let's take a look here. For regular verbs in Spanish, if that verb ends in an AR, remember the endings will be o, as, a, amos, an. Remember, all we do, we take that AR off of that verb and then we just attach those new endings. For ER verbs that are regular, o, es, e, hemos, en. Again, take off that ER, attach those new endings. And finally, for IR verbs, again, we take off that IR and we attach what? O, es, e. In the nosotros form, be careful, it's hemos, I-M-O-S, and then en. So you've noticed, guys, that essentially your ER and IR verbs for regular verbs are essentially the same in their endings except for the nosotros form. So for ER verbs, the nosotros form is E-M-O-S, and for the IR verbs in the nosotros form, the form would be I-M-O-S, okay? So these are our endings for verbs unless the verb is completely irregular, like verbs that we've learned, like the verb ser, to be, yo soy, tú eres, él es, nosotros somos, ellos son. Remember, that particular verb, it's so irregular in its forms that it doesn't even really obey any of those types of endings. That's what I mean when I say that a verb is just so completely irregular. But other than that, what we're getting ready to go into is something that you should already have half of the battle fought, because you know these endings right here. We're still going to be using these same endings. But what's going to happen is that the verb forms are going to be a little unique because in the stem or the root of these particular verbs, there are going to have to be some vowel changes. And this will be a little bit unlike anything that we've studied up to this point, with the exception of a few verbs that we've seen in last chapter. So maybe if you think about how we did verbs like preferir, poder, remember those verbs where for example, in poder, the O changed to a UE, but the rest of the verb was regular as far as the endings? We're going to be doing something very similar to that now. We're going to call these verbs either boot verbs or stem verbs, stem changing verbs. Some people call them one or the other or both. Okay? So let me erase the board, and I want you to, again, keep in your mind these endings that I am erasing up here, because these are forms we've gone over since weeks past. So now we're going to take a look at something called a boot verb. Okay? A boot, oops, I can't write, boot verbs. Alright? Now again, some people call them stem changing verbs. I think that's what the book calls them, but I'm just going to call them boot verbs. Okay? You'll see why in a second. So for these boot verbs, we're going to do something interesting. So let's take, for example, the verb pensar. The verb pensar means to think. Okay? It can even come across as to believe, as in like an opinion. So you would think, based on what we've learned so far in Spanish, that for the yo form we would just say yo pienso, right? Because when you get rid of the AR form for the yo, the subject pronoun yo, would be what? Oh, right? So that much of the verb is okay. But this right here is not correct, because this particular verb, and when we're talking about root verbs, there are certain verbs that do this. All verbs do not. These are just certain select verbs that will go through these changes. Okay? So, as you see, we cannot say yo penso. Cannot say that. This particular verb, pensar, is one that will go through a change. The E is going to change to an IE. The E will change to an IE. And it's going to change in all the forms that fall in the boot. Oh my goodness, what is that? Well, if you draw a little boot around all of these forms, every pronoun and verb that falls within this boot, or what kind of looks like a boot, isn't that pretty? All of those forms are going to go from an E to an IE. And the only one that we deal with that's outside of that boot is nosotros. And nosotros does not go through any change. If it's easier for you to remember that everything changes except nosotros, think of it that way. If it helps you to think of these verbs in terms of the boot, in that everything inside the boot changes, think of it that way. Whatever helps you best. So, let's see what we can do right here. So we know that pensar is going to change an E to an IE inside that boot. So, yo pienso. Alright, you see that? The IE, that O is still the same. Just like it is for any yo form of any AR verb. Alright? But we have to change that E to an IE. It's just a spelling change, okay? Follow that same pattern. Tú piensas. Okay? Pien. Look, the AS is still the same for an AR verb. No biggie there. We've just added IE. Tú piensas. Alright? Él piensa. Él piensa. We change that E to an IE. Again, the A, still the same for an AR verb in the L form. Él piensa, right? Let's go ahead and do the ellos form. The ellos form would be what? Ellos piensan. Yeah? Piensan, E to IE, but just still using the AN for an AR verb. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the nosotros form of these boot verbs does not change. So that means that you will not change the E to an IE. So for that reason, we just simply say, nosotros pensamos. Nosotros pensamos. So, the forms of this verb to think, pensar, are as follows. Yo pienso, tú piensas, él piensa, nosotros pensamos, ellos piensan. Okay? So I think, you think, he thinks, we think, they think. So think of this in these terms, guys. That in English, we know that sometimes there are certain words that we have to spell them in a certain way. We may not necessarily know why we have to spell them that way, but we've used them so much, we know that that's just how it is. For example, the verb thought. T-H-O-U-G-H-T. We know that we have to spell that word, that verb, with a G-H-T, even though we may not pronounce the G-H in there at all. That's just how we spell it. And when we write that word down, we probably don't even think of it much because we've used it so much in our lives. And it's the same thing with these verbs. Most Hispanics are probably not going to be trying to analyze, well, why does that E go to an IE? Why does this E stay the same? It's just that they've used these verbs so much, it's just second nature. So as you practice these verbs, I can promise the more and more you practice them, perhaps the less you will start questioning, well, why does this change this way? It'll just seem like second nature. You'll know that that's just what you have to do. And even though it's not wrong to question, sometimes as adult learners, when we learn a language, we have that desire to question. We want to know why. But sometimes if we just allow the process, the language process to flow and just act like sponges and just absorb all of that, just accept it for what it is, sometimes that can help that language process out a lot better. Okay, so this is an example of a verb that goes from an E to an IE in Spanish. Now let me tell you something. I know some of you are probably thinking, Mr. Lee, how am I going to know if a verb goes from an E to an IE or whatever other change may happen? Well, you have to take notice of the verbs that are listed on page 146, for example, because that is the page that has the boot verbs or the stem change of verbs on them. So I would never in a million years test you or give you a verb that goes through some kind of change, but something that we have not been exposed to, because that wouldn't be fair. There'd be no way you would know that. So if you familiarize yourselves with the verbs that are on the lists on that page and recognize that the verbs that fall in this particular column go from an E to an IE or whatever other change, then I think that will help you a lot, okay? So let me give you a quick example of one more verb that goes from an E to an IE. So now we're going to take the verb to understand. To understand. All right? So here, let me just erase that boot. We'll call that a used boot. We're going to go and get us a brand new boot. All right? So now we're going to look at the verb entender. Okay? To understand. All right. Now, you know that we're going to change, because I'm telling you, the E to an IE. But if you look up there, that verb has 3 E's, doesn't it? Uh-oh, what do we do? Well, exclude automatically the E from the ending, because that has its own pattern, right? So you've got 2 E's left in that stem of the verb, in that root right there. So anytime that is the case and you've got 2 E's, it's always going to be that second E that would go through the change. So it's going to be this one that's going to go from an E to an IE in the boot. Okay? So to say that I understand would be yo entiendo. Tú entiendes. Okay? Él entiende. Let's come over here. Watch this.